right, welcome back. This is kind of a fun little lesson. One of my favorite things to teach. I'm going to tell you about blood groups and how your blood type is determined, as well as how different transfusions can occur. So when we talk about blood groups, we are talking about antigens and antibodies. So this is not an immunology class, but for the sake of this, we do need to talk about what those are. Antigens is any molecule that triggers an immune response. And in this case, the antigens are on the surface of your red blood cell. Those are kind of your label. Okay. Antibodies are little proteins that circulate in the blood plasma, and those respond to an antigen that is non-self for the body. So anything that seems foreign to the body, those antibodies are going to respond. They're kind of like little soldiers, and they're going to take care of that. Now, when we talk about blood groups, we call antigens agglutinogens, and we call antibodies agglutinins. So don't get confused with those terms. They are cross-listable in terms of blood groups. So the different blood groups that there are A, B, and O, and then there's this Rh factor that we're going to get into a little bit later, but ABO is going to be the major blood group designation. ABO is hereditary. So if your mom and dad have a certain type of blood, they're going to pass those alleles on to you, and your blood type is determined from genetics. And this is going to be indicated by the presence of an antigen on the surface of your red blood cells. So for example, here's type A. Okay, here's a blood cell, a red blood cell, and see these little guys poking off the surface. They're little labels or little flags, I like to call them. Those are antigen A. So because this red blood cell has antigen A on its surface, we call this type A. Don't worry about these antibodies just yet. Type B, here's type B blood. So here's a different type of flag or a different type of antigen. This is type B antigen. So because this red blood cell has type B, antigens on the surface, this is type B. AB has both. So here's the A, the orange and the green. So it's got both on its surface. So this is type AB. And then type O has none. Okay, there is no type O antigen, it's just none. Now, what about antibodies? So whatever antigen you don't have on the surface, you have the letter of the antibody in the plasma. Okay, so don't get confused here. Let's take it one at a time. So if you have type A blood, okay, you have type A flag on the surface of your red blood cells. And if you have type A on the surface, you have anti-B antibodies in the bloodstream, which means these anti-B antibodies don't like antigen B. Okay, so you have antigen A, which means that these antibodies aren't going to bother your own blood cells, right? Now think about that. If you had A antibodies in your plasma, all of these little A antibodies would attack your own red blood cells, right? So you have to have the opposite. So if you have A on your surface, you have B antibodies in your plasma. Opposite wise, if you have type B antigen on your surface, you have anti-A antibodies in your plasma. So these little antibodies don't like antigen A, but not to worry because your red blood cells have antigen B. So these antibodies aren't going to bother your own red blood cells. Now, if you have both antigens A and B on the surface, there's no other letter for the plasma for an antibody. So type AB actually doesn't have any antibodies in the plasma, which is going to be very beneficial. We'll talk about that in just a little while. Type O doesn't have any antigens on the surface, but it's going to have both types of antibodies in its plasma. So again, what you don't have on the surface, you'll have in the plasma, just the other letter that's not designated already. Okay, we're going to do some practice, so don't worry. Now, why is this important? Well, when we do blood transfusions, we are transferring different components of the blood. So for simplicity, right, if we do a whole blood transfusion, so you get a bag of blood, all of the components of the blood being transfused into another person, right? Whole blood equals the formed elements plus the plasma. Okay, so not only are we transfusing the cells, those are the formed elements, but we're also transfusing the liquid portion or the plasma. So in terms of antigens and antibodies, what are we transferring? We're transferring the antigens because those are on the formed element. And we're transferring the plasma, which has all of those antibodies in them. So we're transfusing all of this whole blood. But there are different types of transfusions. So before I get to that here, what we need to worry about are those antigens on the surface of the red blood cell of the donor, whoever's donating their blood, reacting with the antibodies that the recipient has. So you can imagine that if the recipient has antibodies that don't like type A blood, we can't give that person red blood cells with A antigen on it because that antigen and those antibodies are not going to get along. Okay, so keep that in mind. We'll do some practice. If that does happen though, we have something called agglutination or clumping of the donor cells. So here's red blood cells all clumping together. And you can imagine that that's really, really, really dangerous in a medical setting. Now there's different types of blood transfusions that you can do. You can just do a packed cell transfusion. In a packed cell transfusion, you're only transfusing the red blood cells. So you're only transfusing the red blood cells and the antigens. You're not transfusing the antibodies as well. Now, what would be a benefit of this? Well, let's say that somebody has anemia and they are low in red blood cells with hemoglobin, right? So maybe they just need some red blood cells. Maybe their plasma levels are okay, but they are a little low in red blood cells. So maybe we give them packed cells. Plasma donation. We are only donating the fluid matrix, which means we are only donating the antibodies. Okay, now when would that be beneficial? Well, right now with COVID, people's COVID antibodies in their plasma are being transfused into individuals for like research and things like that. But blood volume. Okay, so if we need to up, let's say the proteins in somebody's blood or the overall blood volume, their plasma volume, some type of dissolved ion in that plasma is low, then we can give a plasma transfusion, assuming that their red blood cells are fine. Okay, or we can give all of it, right? And if we do a whole blood transfusion, you're transfusing all of this, right? You're transfusing the antigens plus the antibodies. This is going to be a lot of like your trauma situations. Somebody who's bleeding profusely, somebody whose hemoglobin is low, blood volume's low, they're dehydrated, all of those things. You may just need to give them the whole volume of blood. Maybe they're, at 2 liters of blood is circulated in their body instead of the minimum of 4. Okay. So when you think about blood donations, there's this terminology called universal, right? Universal donor, universal recipient. What does that mean? So the universal donor is type O, kind of. Okay, so I want to caution you here on this just a little bit. Now, why would type O be a universal donor? Well, because it doesn't have any antigens on its surface. And if it doesn't have any antigens, there's nothing for an antibody to react to, right? What about though, if you're giving a whole blood transfusion? If you're giving a whole blood transfusion, you are transfusing not only those cells, but you're also transfusing its antibodies. And remember that if you don't have anything on the surface, you have both types of antibodies. And if you put these antibodies into a donor who is a different type, who has an antigen that your antibodies aren't going to like, that could be problematic. And so a lot of times with these transfusions, what they'll do, if they can't give you your exact type because of a shortage or it's not available or something like that, you can either give that blood slowly to prevent that antibody antigen reaction from happening at a large scale. You can remove those antibodies. You can treat that blood so those antibodies are removed. Or you can also give the recipient like some type of medication to help from that reaction occurring. Now, that's donor. So you can imagine that that's the universal donor because it doesn't have any antigens on its surface to react with antibodies in somebody else's bloodstream, right? Now, what about universal recipient? So somebody can receive any type of blood, right? That's a good thing, right? If you don't have to worry about shortages, right? Well, kind of. Okay, so type AB, remember, doesn't have any antibodies in its plasma, which means whatever cell that you put in there, it's not going to react because there's no antibodies here to react to it. However, if you give whole blood here and you put these anti-B antibodies into this person's bloodstream, these antibodies are going to react with these antigens. So again, you can give it slowly or remove those antibodies. Well, no, you can, sorry, this is a typo. You can't remove the antibodies because it's the, let's see, hold on. Yeah, so you can remove the antibodies of the donor before you give that transfusion, or just give it slowly to minimize that reaction. Yes, that's true. But I just want you to keep in mind that there's different types of transfusions. So we'll talk about an example of when the type O might be a universal donor without any problem. But normally what they'll do is just give you your same type if they can. And so here, let's just go ahead and show this for just a second here. So let's just say, for example, that you have somebody who is type O, who wants to donate their blood to a recipient. So we have a type O donor. Okay. And this type O donor's blood has nothing on the surface, but it has A and B antibodies in the bloodstream. Okay. Okay, so let's just say that this donor wants to donate to a recipient who is type B. Now remember, we said type O is a universal donor, right? So it shouldn't be a problem, but let's see what this looks like. So let's see what this type B person's blood looks like. They have B antigens on their surface. And if they have B antigens on their surface, what do they have in the bloodstream as antibodies? A, right? It's just the opposite. Oops, that should be an A. Okay, now, if you give whole blood of this type O, what are you donating? Oops. All of this, right? So if you put all of that into this bloodstream, what's going to happen? This B and this B are going to react. And I draw it this way with the uppercase and lowercase to help me with this exact concept. Okay. Now let's think about if we were doing a packed cell transfusion. Okay. If we were doing a packed cell transfusion, we get all the difference. Over here. If we were doing a packed cell transfusion, what are we donating here from O? Just that cell with nothing on it, right? That's a safe transfusion that we don't even have to worry anything about, right? We're not donating anything to react with anything in here. If we're doing a plasma donation from type O, we're doing a plasma donation from type O, what are we donating? This stuff, right? Which are those little A's and those little B's. And if we put those little A's and those little B's into here, now we have those B's are reacting, okay? So that's something that I just want to kind of point out with donations is that you can be universal in a time of, desperation, but there are some things to look out for. It's not perfect. A type O cannot just go ahead, hook me up and donate me to whoever without worrying about something happening. Now, the most common blood types in the US are type O and A, O being the most common, which is 47%, A being the second most common. AB is the least common. Now, if you come over here to this chart from your book, you see that type O is pretty much the most prevalent in most people, but in the Asian American countries, they have a lot of type A as well as type B, and they're actually the highest in AB as well. When we do this, we do blood typing in class on ground at Doane, and the students get to type themselves. We mostly have O and A. We had one B last year, and he was actually in the Hispanic population. So that was kind of interesting because B in the United States is only about 9%, but it's pretty prevalent in the Hispanic population. So we talked about ABO. What about RH factor? Because we know that we're not just type A, B, or O. We are A positive, we are B negative, right? We're O positive, O negative. What does that mean? So RH factor is the designation as positive or negative. It's named after the rhesus monkey, which is where it was discovered. And we designate this by letter D. Okay, so most people are Rh positive, which means that they have the antigen D on the surface of their red blood cells. That's inherited typically. Now the antibodies in the plasma are a different story. So if you are negative blood type, meaning you do not have that antigen on your surface, for ABO, it would be true that you would then have that antibody in your plasma. But for Rh factor, it's not that way. For Rh factor, you only develop antibodies to Rh factor if you have previously been exposed to the antigen before. And this might be in a transfusion reaction or your blood mixing somehow during childbirth, something like that. So you don't necessarily have the antibodies just because you don't have the antigen for Rh factor. And a good example of this is in pregnancy. So those of you who maybe have children, maybe already have an idea of what this is about. But basically, if you are Rh negative, so if you're any negative blood type, something to be aware of is what your partner's blood type is. If your partner is a Rh positive, remember that that antigen can be passed on genetically. And so there's a chance that your fetus might be Rh positive. And if you have an Rh fetus, positive fetus inside a mom who's Rh negative, remember that mom doesn't necessarily have antibodies that she knows of yet because maybe she's never been exposed to Rh positive blood before, but now she's going to be exposed to it because she's pregnant with a fetus with Rh positive blood. Now, her first pregnancy, let's just assume that she's never been exposed before, so she doesn't have any antibodies that are going to harm that fetus. However, during birth, the maternal and fetal blood mix because that placental membrane ruptures. Now, during birth, mom is going to probably develop some anti-D antibodies to, like in her bloodstream, to a future fetus who might be Rh positive. And so if she gets pregnant again, now her body has those antibodies in it. And let's say that she has this child with the same guy who's Rh positive. Okay. Now her antibodies may attack those fetal cells. And this is something called erythroblastosis fetalis, which is when mom's anti-D antibodies, anti-Rh antibodies, attack those fetal red blood cells and cause them to be destroyed. Can cause severe anemia, hemolytic anemia in a fetus and be very dangerous and deadly. Okay, so basically what her body is doing, her immune system is attacking her fetus. Now, what we can do if we know that this is going to be happening is give this shot called RhoGAM. And some of you who have either given birth to a scenario like this before, or have even miscarried a fetus, they usually give you RhoGAM in the ER or wherever you're being seen, your OB's office, in order to basically tone down mom's immune system and tell her to stop attacking those red blood cells. That way she can carry this pregnancy safely, if need be. Now, here's what this looks like in a picture. So here's Rh negative mom. Okay, Rh negative mom, nothing on her blood cells, right? She is a fetus who has this little antigen here, which we're going to call D, antigen D, which means this fetus is positive. And if in order for that to happen, the father of that child has to be Rh positive. Okay, so mom's body doesn't care about that fetus for her first pregnancy. Now, during childbirth, these blood types are going to mix, right? So now some of those fetal cells have gotten into mom's bloodstream. So some of those fetal cells with antigen D have gotten into mom's bloodstream, and naturally the immune system doesn't recognize things that are foreign, that it hasn't seen before, right? So naturally, mom is going to make antibodies, which are these little guys, to those fetal cells and destroy them. That's okay. She doesn't need them anymore, right? Her baby's born. Okay. But those antibodies stick around for a long time. So now mom has these antibodies that if those fetal cells were to enter her circulation again, we would have problems, right? Her antibodies would attack that. And antibodies can cross the placental membrane here. And so that's what's happening. So mom's antibodies are crossing the placental membrane here and attacking her fetal red blood cells, which will cause those red blood cells to rupture. And if those red blood cells rupture, then the baby cannot carry enough oxygen, right? And we got all kinds of problems, right? That's called erythroblastosis fetalis. Okay, so what I want to do next is talk about some examples here of, I want to stop sharing. There we go. Okay, what I want to do is talk about some examples of blood transfusions. Okay. Let's just say that we have somebody who is type AB, wants to donate to somebody who's type A. Okay, can this happen? Okay, the first step would be to draw out the different blood types, right? So what does type A B look like? We have A antigens on the surface and we have B antigens on the surface. That gives them their label, right? Their type, those antigens. Now, if we have both antigens on the surface, what do we have in the plasma? Nothing, right? Both antigens are accounted for. Both letters are accounted for. They want to donate to type A. Okay, so type A has A antigens on the surface. And if we have A antigens on the surface, we have B antibodies in the plasma. Okay, that's our recipient, which means that all of this is important, right? The recipient, whoever's getting the blood, we can't take one of these things away, right? So if we want to donate type AB blood to type A, can we do that? Okay, well, it depends, right? If we want to donate whole blood, and let's just say we have no, I'm just going to draw X's for no antibodies in the plasma, right? If we want to donate whole blood, we're donating all of this into here. Are there any cross listings of letters, capital and lowercase, that are going to be affected here? Yes, right? When we put these cells into this person's B antibodies are going to start attacking the red blood cells. These Bs are not going to match. So we cannot do whole blood transfusion. If we can't do whole blood transfusion, we also, if we can't do whole blood transfusion, we need to think about the other two types of transfusions. So if we want to donate packed cells, we're just donating this AB antigen. No, again, we can't do that, right? Because these Bs are going to cross. Okay, so we can't do packed cells, we can't do whole blood. Can we do plasma? We should be able to, right? If we're doing plasma, all we're donating are these antibodies, which are nothing, right? Technically, there are none. And if we want to donate that in there, you know, nothing's going to react with anything here because we aren't donating any letters. Okay, so plasma, check, right? So that would be beneficial in some ways. Let's just say that they were low in like hemoglobin or something, though, oxygen carrying capacity, and they needed these red blood cells. We can't, right? Who could? Who could donate to this type A person? Let's say packed cells or whole blood. Okay, if we have, let's talk about O. O is supposed to be the universal donor, right? If you have type O, okay, nothing on the surface, but we have both A's and B's in the plasma, right? What of that type O can we donate to this donor? The cells, right? So that's good because the red blood cells have the oxygen carrying capacity. So if this person was super anemic and didn't have enough hemoglobin, this type O person, we could totally give them the red blood cells of that type O person. What we couldn't do is give them the whole blood without removing, we'd have to remove these antibodies before we do it. Okay, let's do another example. Let's bring in Rh factor this time. So let's talk about Rh factor. Let's talk about a type O positive donor, which is a very common blood type. And let's talk about the second most common blood type, which is type A positive. Okay, what do these look like? So this is something we haven't talked about quite yet. So type O positive. What do we have on the surface? We don't have A, we don't have B, but this antigen is inherited. So we do have D. Okay, but we have A's and B's in the plasma. How about type A? A and B and B in the plasma. Okay. What types of transfusions could occur here? Can we do so? Yeah, right. This D and this D doesn't matter if they're the same letter. We just care if there's little antibodies with the little d over here that are going to react, and there's not because they have the antigen on their surface. How about whole blood? Not unless we remove these A's, right? Otherwise, they're going to react with that A. Okay. How about Rh negative? So let's say that we have somebody who's B negative. Can they donate to somebody who's B positive? Okay. What does B negative look like? Okay, B, that's our label, right? We don't have a positive, so we don't have a D. We have A. Now, because we're negative, do we have little d's in the plasma? We don't know, right? They would have to be tested in the lab for these. We don't know if they have these because we don't know if they've been exposed before. Let's just say for simplicity measures that they don't. Let's say they've never been exposed, so they don't have those antibodies to D. Can they donate to B positive? Okay. Absolutely, right? They can donate anything to B positive, right? So if they donate just their packed cells, great, no problem, right? That doesn't matter. We're just looking for big and littles, right? What if we want to donate everything? Still doesn't matter because antibodies and antibodies, they're not going to react to each other, right? So yeah, B negative to B positive is great. What if we want to reverse that reaction? Transfusion, rather. What if we want to put the B positive person into the B negative person? Okay, let's look at this. Okay. What if we want to do that? Can we do that? Maybe, right? So we can definitely do the packed cells. Maybe. We can definitely do plasma. So that means that we can probably do a whole blood transfusion, but what do we need to be aware of in this recipient? What do they need to be tested for? Have they been exposed to the antibodies before? Now, if they haven't been exposed, then it's okay. We can totally do this transfusion. Once you do that transfusion once, though, they're going to have these for sure. So if you wanted to do this transfusion a second time, what you would need to do is give RhoGAM. And that would shut this person's immune system down from attacking those Ds. Now, so you can donate positive to negative with caution. You can always donate negative to positive. You can donate positive to negative with caution. You may need to give RhoGAM. Okay. So those are just some examples of blood typing. I'm going to give you an assignment to do a few more examples of that. And then we will move on to blood vessels. So we're moving right along here.